Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul, and today we're going to be looking at some numbers that we crunched behind the scenes in order to help inform our unit comparisons and our tier list for our Battle Tome review. I'm not going to be the only one talking about numbers today, though. Today on the podcast, I've got...
Hey, y'all, it's David.
Hey, it's McGonk.
So we are going to start looking at shooting units. I feel like that's an easy unit to compare across the board from each other. You don't have to really worry about fighting in the opponent's turn. I guess, with covering fire in the game now, that is a bit of a concern. But for the most part, your shooting units are doing the damage on your turn. You can set up your positioning very well, so they're very easy and straightforward to compare them, especially in Stormcast, where most of our shooting units are, not that different, in terms of shooting infantry. You've got 12 to 15 to 18-inch range. You've got some amount of damage, certain amount of models and health. It's not like they're wildly different units, Raptors are a little different from Judicators, but not really that much. I think it's also fair to assume these units are going to have a +1 hit effect of some kind. In the past, we've shown, what this looks like without the +1 hit, but I think it's kind of just redundant information right now, since it's so easy to get +1 hit between, all-out attack or Vigilors. It's very, very easy to get +1 hit on shooting, and we're also very likely to use reinforced shooting units, and that means if you have a reinforced unit, you're going to be using all-out attack on it. Really, really easy to get +1 hit. Now, we will not be considering anti-X, so like anti-infantry, anti-monster, anti-cavalry. We're not going to be looking at these things directly. We're going to talk about them, but it's really easy to do that in this case, because what you do is you just slide the unit one thing along the table. You'll see what I mean when we get there. The reason we're not really considering it is shooting has to be able to hit any kind of target based on the situation. Obviously, there's going to be some matchups where anti-infantry on crossbows won't matter because your opponent doesn't have any kind of infantry, or maybe they're playing Night Haunt and they just don't care about Rend in general. But there's also going to be times where you'll need to shoot cavalry. Even in a list that has infantry, they may not necessarily get shot at, so it's worthwhile to consider what this unit looks like in all scenarios. The Ballista, Castigators, Judicators, these units will be retired, but we are going to still look at them because they're still relevant for the next 6 months. The Lord Ordinator, on the other hand, will not be considered. His buff is only about 40% damage increase on average to one Ballista, and he costs more than a Ballista, so there's just no reason to consider him. He's too expensive. He's not going to make the cut. There's other factors to consider besides just damage. We've got the range of units. We've got mobility of different shooting units. Can the units retreat and shoot? Can they run and shoot? Just how mobile are they? Can they teleport themselves, if that was a factor? Covering fire is a serious consideration. It's a very powerful command, and which unit has the best covering fire is part of our analysis for which unit's going to be the best overall. How much health is also very relevant. Less so if you're just playing against melee armies. There are scenarios where your shooting units will get stuck in combat, and the amount of health they have can be relevant because it allows them to survive and then retreat and then start rallying back. So, for example, if you have 10 Judicators with 20 health, they're more likely to survive that scenario than 6 Raptors with only 12 health. And the last major consideration, I'd say, for shooting units is the regiments. This is a serious problem in the Stormcast army in general, in particular for Vanguard and Sacrosanct units. It is very difficult to find just any hero that can bring them. You have to go out of your way to find heroes that can bring them. Using the Zephyros or the Aquilor is not very exciting, so you're usually using a War Master of some kind, or one of these heroes that can bring any units like a War Master would. And so that's a serious consideration. I feel like I've been babbling too much. Do you guys have anything you want to add before we start looking at the tables?
I think I just want to say, try to look at these different types of comparisons more practically than just in a vacuum. For example, some things may be better depending on your local meta than other metas. So try to take everything as if you were going to put on the battlefield against your typical opponents, I would say.
Yeah, that's definitely worth pointing out. We're just going to present you guys with the data. The context is very important. This is just raw numbers without context, so it's very important that we analyze this properly, and we don't just fall into a trap of saying, oh, this unit does the most damage, therefore it's the best, right? That's not what the point of this video is. We are just going to be comparing different units, seeing their pros and cons. Damage is obviously a big part of it, but there's a lot more to consider as well. Right, so let's look at the first table here. This is comparing reinforced units of each of these units. looking at them with +1 hit and their expected damage against all the different save values. Now you can see that against everything except 6-up saves, long strikes are the highest damage per unit. That doesn't mean the highest damage per point, but if you have a single unit, and this is important for reasons like all-out attack or covering fire, or things that only one unit in your army can do per turn, long strikes are the king. They do the most damage, the most reliably, absolutely no contest. Hurricane crossbows are starting to look pretty good at only 100 points, but you can see even at 100 points, a squad of 6 hurricanes just does less damage than 6 long strikes. Even if you were to add 1 Ren to the hurricanes, let's say they were shooting infantry, so in this example, looking at the slide, instead of doing 5.8 damage to a 3-up, they would do effectively 8.7. They're still doing worse than long strikes. It's crazy how much stronger long strikes are than everything else. Which makes sense. They cost more points, they should do more damage. That seems to make sense. Against a 3-up save, long strikes will deal about 28% more damage per unit than bow judicators. But we're going to see a very interesting thing happen when we look at the efficiency rates, looking at per point cost rather than per unit. Now, hurricanes and crossbow judicators are both scaling very, very well with the extra rend. You can see hurricanes go from 2.9 against a 2-up save all the way up to 14.4 against a 6-up save. That is a tremendous damage increase, which signifies that each point of rend is worth way more on a Hurricane Raptor unit than it is on a long strike unit. Now, both of these units will struggle with 2-up saves. You don't want to just bring a whole bunch of Hurricane Raptors with no plan on how to crack those saves open. You could bring things like the Purple Sun in order to increase your shooting damage. That can be tough to do because the Purple Sun has to charge into combat. It can't just walk into combat anymore. Grondis can cast his -1 save spell, and that starts to get pretty good with Hurricanes, but like I said, even with the extra rend point, Hurricanes are still looking worse than long strikes against the same targets. Vigilors, as you can see on here, are just not good damage output. I think a lot of people are trying to use reinforced Vigilors as a hammer unit because they don't have something like bow judicators, and they're just tired of using long strikes, or maybe their list can't fit the long strikes because of the Vanguard requirement. But you can see here, 10 Vigilors are not doing very good damage at all. About 8 damage against a 4-up save is not impressive, especially not for their point cost, as you guys will see shortly. And I'm sure this is consistent with what we've seen in games, right? Like the 10 Vigilor block is just not doing a lot of damage. Ballistas are just bad, which makes sense. A single ballista is 140 points. We're comparing it to reinforced units of shooting, but obviously it's worth looking at a ballista. You can just multiply this by 2 or 3 or 4 or however many you want to do. I think the ballista information gets a lot more interesting when we look at the efficiency. Castigators are an interesting one. They're not that far behind bow judicators, and for example, if they have their anti-cavalry shooting, then they suddenly become better than bow judicators. But this is assuming they get to crit on 5s, which means they didn't move that turn or they didn't use a setup, and that is a hard scenario to manufacture, and I don't know how reliable that's going to be. So in the best case scenario where castigators don't move and they're shooting at cavalry, okay, they're slightly better than bow judicators, but they're still worse than long strikes, which is just sad. Looking at their damage per 100 points, you can see long strikes suddenly fall off a cliff. After shooting at a 4-up save, they are just no longer an efficient choice, which makes sense. They're a very low volume unit with high accuracy, so they're very good against high effective health units, but that effective health has to come through saves. Hurricanes, on the other hand, scale like crazy in terms of efficiency. As you shoot weaker and weaker save units, Hurricanes easily become the highest damage shooting in the book per point spent, which makes sense. They got cut down to 100 points per squad, which I thought was crazy. I'm surprised they cut them down to 100 points. That just seems too low for a unit like that. I think that is the right cost for them. I'm just surprised that they did it.
I think it's also interesting to note that the reason this hit per 100 is important is because as Stormcast, we struggle with high volume shooting, and since that point cut, Hurricanes is a way to get more shots into your lists now.
Yeah, they're not a perfect unit by any means. 12-inch range really restricts what they can shoot at, and if you're relying on them teleporting into range or coming out of reserves and then shooting, people have a very easy redeploy. If they just redeploy on a 3+, they get out of range very easily. So if you try to bring too many Hurricanes, it really becomes a struggle. So even though they are the most efficient shooting per point that you can bring, especially with anti-infantry, you just really struggle to use them, and it's hard to put that much damage on the table against a universal command that just denies your damage on a 3+.
Yeah, like that's the thing with Hurricane Raptors. I feel like they're almost like a suicide unit because your opponent just has to roll a 3 if you deploy them from Scions. And if you don't do that, then it's just like, so you have to basically just run and shoot with them, which restricts their range to, I believe, like max 12 plus 12, 24, which means you pretty much have to be in their face and suicide that Hurricane Raptor unit.
Yeah, and they're not durable enough to survive that combat. They're not like a beefy unit of Judicators that has a whole bunch of health. They're a fragile unit.
Yeah, I mean, 6 wounds on a 3-up save.
We could also use manifestations to try to lock people into place, like Pendulum. With the new FAQ now, they confirmed you could put manifestations that can move within each other. So you could sometimes use some tricks where you could swing different big manifestations into into units to hold them in place so they cannot redeploy. But yeah, overall, it's really hard to get Hurricanes in. You just have to be really careful with them and precise.
Yeah, the easiest thing would be to drop them in range of 2 targets minimum, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much what you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I will say, I was going to say, I'd also, one funny trick I did end up doing when I was playtesting, I dropped a bridge behind the unit I was going to shoot at, because my Arcanum I ran him up, and then next turn passed. And he literally couldn't redeploy the bridge. He just didn't roll high enough. So there are different tricks you could do, but yeah, the best option is probably just be in range of 2 targets.
That is the coolest thing I've ever heard. I'm going to summon a bridge behind you so that you can't run away from my guns. That's so cool. Back to the chart, you can see bow adjudicators are almost the same efficiency as long strikes against most targets, and they start scaling better even as you get into worse saves. But what that shows me is that for every point you spend on long strikes, you could spend the same amount of points on bow adjudicators and get the same damage per point in your list. So if you spend 600 points on long strikes, you'd get the same damage roughly as 600 points of bow adjudicators, which is very, very interesting. Now, in the best case scenario, we talked about castigators earlier. Even if they get the crit 5 up, they're still less efficient than bow adjudicators. So I think that kind of just kills the argument for castigators being played right now. Unless they get significantly cheaper, I don't think there's any reason whatsoever. They're hard to slot in. The sacrosanct bonuses don't really benefit them that much, and their damage output is worse than a unit that is very easy to slot in with bow adjudicators. And the last surprising thing on this is crossbow adjudicators are not that efficient. You would expect a unit like that, high volume but no rend and lower range, so it should make up for it in terms of efficiency, but it's just not that efficient. It's less efficient than bow adjudicators unless it has the anti-infantry, and even then, only against specific targets. Like if you're fighting 2-up save infantry, the bow adjudicators will typically still do better. It's quite surprising, really. Vigilors are not very efficient damage output. You can see they're among the worst in terms of our damage per point. But that's fine. Vigilors don't need to be good damage. They're a utility screening MSU shooting unit. They're not a reinforced hammer. It's okay, though, because they're not meant to be a reinforced hammer. Ballistas are the last interesting one here. You can see just how poorly efficient just their efficiency is. Each one of them is a single unit, which takes up a slot in a regiment. They can't be reinforced. They have a 3-inch move. They require an ordinator in order to buff them, and only one of them can get buffed. So ballistas are just all around a terrible, terrible unit at their current cost. They have almost no redeeming quality whatsoever.
They should just let the Ordinator go out with a bang. Just let them buff every single ballista.
Yeah.
Within range. They should just let them go out with a bang. But that's my opinion.
Well, they don't know what to do with artillery as in general. Like, it's not just a ballista problem. It's no one's artillery is really that good, and they just haven't figured out a niche for it.
It should probably be range, right? If it's going to be slow and it's going to be similar damage output, the benefit of it should be having a longer range. I think
it should be the counter to infantry shooters who are all shooting at 18.
Yeah.
But it isn't.
Yeah. So I've put these two charts together just to demonstrate. Everybody considers long strikes to be the best shooting unit in the Stormcast army for good reason. They're an excellent unit. And these charts really do demonstrate that. If you look at the top one, this is the scenario with +1 hit. Long strikes have been set to a default 100% and everything else is compared to that. So you can see that across the board, Hurricane Raptors are just doing less damage than long strikes into every target. Some interesting stuff happens at lower save values, but for the most part, everything is just worse damage per unit than long strikes. When you switch to efficiency, looking at per 100 points spent, long strikes are still the most efficient into 2-up saves, but against everything else, they start to fall apart. You can see Hurricanes are just scaling out of control. Bow Judicators are keeping up at 2s and 3s, and then they start scaling faster and better. Long strikes are not an efficient shooting unit, but they are a powerful shooting unit, and I think they're reasonably well designed for what they do. So, conclusions. What can we draw from these numbers so far? I think it's fair to say most of our shooting units are overcosted compared to long strikes. Long strikes have so many advantages. They have the best range that we have at 18 inches. They have the Vanguard Chamber to give them great mobility. They have the best covering fire. They have the best rend. They really shouldn't be the best shooting option in almost every regard. There needs to be a niche for certain units in certain scenarios, like maybe, Hurricane Raptors should be higher volume. Maybe they should be more models. I don't know. There's lots of ways you could fix this. Bow Judicators are a reasonable alternative to long strikes, but they come with way less utility. The only reason I consider Bow Judicators to be viable right now is because you don't have to pay the Vanguard tax, which is bringing a hero that can take a Vanguard hero, or a Vanguard unit, I should say.
Yep. You're not locked into War Master or the Knight Zephyros, which the Knight Zephyros is going away, so that'll most likely be the 180 point Lord Aquilor.
Yeah, and that's not, if you consider him a tax, like a minimum is to pay 180 points on a bad hero in order to bring a good shooting unit. Well, why couldn't you spend those points on just more shooting units? Stormcast have good points and bad points in terms of units. I think things like screens and support heroes, I would consider that bad points. They're not the units that are going to win the game for you. The units that win game for Stormcast are the hammer units and the anvils, right? The stuff that takes charges and the stuff that does the charging and the shooting. If we could play a game that was 100% hammers and no screens, that would be perfect. But we bring screens and heroes and things like that because they make our hammers better. But still, there's always the argument of, well, I could just bring more hammers. Why should I bring a third hero when I could just bring 200 more points of hammer units? And that's what Stormcast want to do. So instead of bringing 360 points of long strikes and then a 130 point hero, you could just bring 500 points of Judicators instead. And instead of doing the same damage per point, you're doing more because you're bringing more of the shooting unit. Given all their drawbacks, Ballistas really need some kind of unique niche. They're just an unplayably bad unit. I think dropping them to 100 points would be a good start. You can see what that would look like in the chart on this slide here. I've got some suggested point values. Trying to, quickly balance things rather than issuing erratas and changing things. Sometimes it's easier just to change point values. And I think you could reasonably get these a lot closer, or at least make people feel less stupid for bringing them. Like, there's just... The Ballista is such a bad unit. If it was 100 points, it would still be bad, but at least there'd be an argument for it,
Bear in mind, too, that based on a lot of GTs and worlds and all that, expect long strikes to at least probably go up to a 400 minimum for reinforced unit. So that's also something you gotta factor in, because now you're even paying more for the same shooting unit.
Well, they might not go to 400 because Raptors aren't what's making that list win. It's the Paladors. Those I fully expect to get nerfed. But more specifically, I think they've pointed the initial long strike cost based on our tax. And when I say tax, I mean non-legend tax. Like, they factored in like what would happen if you take a War Master or a Lord Aquilor. I think the points, they could go up next update, but once those Legends units rotate out, I think including the long strikes becomes a lot more finicky for our lists, because we have to bring like those huge over 300 point units or a Lord Aquilor at the minimum to bring them.
Well, like you said, Mergonk, there's other ways to nerf long strikes without nerfing them directly. If Paladors get worse, if they become less appealing, if they become more difficult to put into your lists, then I can certainly see people just opting out of long strikes entirely, or at least until, the Great Purge happens next summer.
I mean, I expect GW to be. In the past, they've been pretty reactionary when it comes to stuff like this. Like, they just overreact always. They nerf the army to the ground. And then, we have to hit like a 42% win rate for them to like give us a nerf to where we're playable again. Given the recent battle scroll, the last one where they like nerfed all the really like overperforming armies, like they didn't really get touched that much. Like Nighthawk is still pretty top. Like Ostergone Reaper is still pretty good. Lumineth probably got the worst like hand with their rules change, but that's just because their rules just weren't interactive at all. I'm expecting like a light touch, but maybe something good to compensate. So we'll see.
Moral of the story is we will always adjust. That's the Stormcast way.
Yeah, I mean, I did at this point. The next time they print they give us the Thunderstrike Vanguard Raptors, and we sort of have an idea of what they look like via Amberguard. They should just put like a giant like leather book on those things, because this unit has been carrying the Stormcast like battle tome for like 9 years. Just like put a book on your long strike models already.
So I've got some suggested point costs here. I think this would really go a long way to fixing the internal balance with Stormcast shooting. I think ballistas could go down to 100 points, and the Lord Ordinator could go down to 100 points as well. Then you could bring a core shooting package of Ordinator with 3 ballistas for 400 points, and that could do pretty good damage output. I don't think it would be broken by any means, given all the weaknesses that ballistas have. They can't be revived with Heaven Sent. They're 3-inch moves, so if they ever get in base-to-base combat, they're in combat until they die. Lord Ordinator just doesn't really do anything else besides buff one unit, so I think that's all fine. Then I think I'd also suggest cuts to Judicators, both crossbow Judicators and bow Judicators, with crossbows taking a 20-point cut and bows going down 10. I think this is just to represent how much power is tied into the long strike and hurricane mobility. Being able to run and shoot, retreat and shoot, these are really, really powerful effects, especially now that we have the Stormreach portal. You can do things like retreat out of combat and then teleport with the Stormreach portal and then shoot something on the other side of the table, from a new point of safety. There's a lot of power in the Vanguard Chamber ability, and I think the point cost for the Warrior Chamber units that just don't have an ability, I think that could be a little bit lower. Obviously, it can't go too low, because they still are a lot of health on a 3-up save, so you don't want them to turn into a super durable, tanky shooting unit. But if you look at something like Crossbow Judicators doing max 20 damage with no rend, compare that to Ideneth Reavers, who are cheaper than what I've proposed, who are still doing much more damage for lower cost, I think, there's a Stormcast tax, but it's okay for some of our units to still get a bit cheaper. So this chart would look a lot healthier with these point values. Castigators are a hard one to predict, because I think they need to be better than Judicators. They have to be like a reward for playing Sacrosanct, because they're so limited in terms of what regiments they go in and what they combo with. Have you guys tried Castigators at all yet in this edition? They're underwhelming. I've tried them twice, and each time I was disappointed with them.
No, I've only tried Hurricanes and Long Strikes. Hurricanes are surprising. It's not a unit I've ever would have used if they didn't go down to 100 points for 3. But I am using, if anybody else wants some Thunderstrike Hurricane guys, I am using the Ember Guard crossbow guy as my Hurricane Raptors. So they've been good to me. But Castigators, I haven't, and I know people have been talking about it, but I don't know. I think they're really just not at a good place right now.
Yeah, Castigators don't feel good. Plus the fact that if you're not building like a Lord Arcanum on Teleron lists, it means you have to take a Knight Incanter for 140. Which, I don't know how good she is this edition. That really long range turn 1 spell that just destroyed your army just doesn't exist anymore. So, yeah, Castigators are a hard sell, both like damage, efficiency, and then army building option wise.
Okay, let's take a look at our cavalry units next. These are all the units that are mounted. That's going to include the Stormdrake Guard, even though they don't have the cavalry keyword. We're going to look at these units reinforced in order to see their max damage per unit. Then we're going to break it down by per 100 point values like we did with the shooting. The reason it's fair to use them as reinforced units is because that's how Stormcast want to use their cavalry. We get big bonuses from reviving units with Heaven Sent. We want the biggest units possible. We want to make sure that when we charge something, we wipe it out in a single attack. There's nothing left for to counterattack, and we can just do it all again the next turn. For this analysis, we're going to assume that units that shoot and fight are going to have both included. Units with conditional bonuses or charge damage or things like that, all of that's going to be accounted for. We're going to assume Stormdrakes are charging. We're going to assume that they can use their Rampage. We're going to get the Lightning Breath in on the Dracoths. We're going to do all this stuff. We're going to give them the best case scenario, right? We are not going to add in anti-X. Again, Cavalry is one of these units like shooting that needs to engage all kinds of units. You can't bring a cavalry unit that is specialized against fighting infantry because your cavalry needs to be on different sides of the board at fighting different things. So think of it as a bonus. We will also look at a case with bonuses to hit and wound, because unlike shooting, we can use Finest Hour on all cavalry, and unlike shooting, the mounts don't benefit from +1 hit from Vigilor, so it's tougher to get +1 hit on multiple units. So it is fair to look at a scenario where you have buffed a unit to see what happens, like, oh, maybe this unit's really good without buffs, but with buffs, it just doesn't scale as well, and it isn't worth buffing, therefore. There are +1 attack bonuses you can get from Bless weapons, for example. If you get the Big Bless, I can count the number of times I've gotten the Big Bless off in one hand this edition. It's not reliable. It's a niche play with a very expensive hero. I don't think it's worth considering in this analysis. And lastly, because I know people will ask, we will not be considering the Stormstrike Chariot here. This isn't a scenario like the Ballista, where you can just slot a single Ballista in and it's doing comparable damage. Chariots have a huge opportunity cost. They are not going to be getting all-out attack. They are not going to be getting power through. There are always other units in the Stormcast army that want to use these very important command abilities, especially other cavalry units. I think it's always better to use power through on a cavalry unit to get it to survive, rather than on a Stormstrike Chariot to do some additional damage. Looking at our first chart here, what stands out to you guys at first glance? Is there anything very interesting on this chart?
I wish the Stormstrikes were way better. It's just so depressing. They're such cool models.
Yeah, they just replicated Blood Knights with them, didn't they? Don't really see a point to them. What's interesting is, like, we like to think that our analysis is pretty spot on, but initially we didn't grade Javelins that high. I think especially in our in index review, but by the time the Battle Tome rolled around with the new points, we were like, oh, wait a second. We sort of missed this. This unit is really, really good. I'm still like a little preferential towards Axes because, at least in my meta, I tend to get caught in sustained combats, and so that -1 to wound is pretty handy. But hey, Javelins did win Worlds, 2 units of 6. Expect that unit to be 250 by the time, January ends next year. But yeah, Pallador's... Oh, go ahead, David.
I was going to reiterate with you. I've been playing 2x6 Axes, and I know Jack has too. I just like Axes more. That doesn't mean Javs are bad, like you said, or anything. It's really just preference. Like, it's a 10-point difference per unit. If you like Javelins more, use Javelins. I also kept bash my guys with Axes, so I just like saying I have Axes as well.
Yeah, and I believe like Axes might not take as much of a hit, maybe like a 10-point hit, and then Javelins will be the one that take a 30-point hit. I could see a 250, 240 situation going on, and Axes will still be good. Like, it just means you have to make room in our list for something else. Very surprised by Stormdrake Guard. Pretty good damage, but my god, that points investment for the amount of board control you get in a season where battle tactics are all about mobilities. It's pretty hard to justify unless you're just tabling your opponents and you don't care about points at all.
Yep.
I don't play like that. The Dracothian Guard are great, but my problem with the Dracothian Guard again is not their efficiency. I think that's always been pretty decent. The problem is when you're fighting other reinforced cavalry and other factions, you're going up against an attack pool and health pool that is just, and control pool for that matter, for when that becomes relevant, that is just way leagues above yours. And that's where every model loss in a Dracothian Guard is a big hit to that efficiency, whereas that might not be true for something like Vanguard Pallador. Stormstrike Palladors are just disappointing. I've been trying them in 2 to 3 lists that I have for fun, and it's like, man, do they not do anything. Even in the ideal situation that you want them in, where they're charging and something in a warrior chamber has died, so they have strike first, it's like, this is not a unit you want to take 6 of. Honestly, I've had more success using them as a flank or 3 of that people can sort of ignore, but they can get dangerous a bit, in the late game. And that's a sad position for like a shock cavalry unit to be, in Games Workshop's own words.
Yeah, that's the role we kind of gave them when we did our Battle Tome review. Is this is not going to be the reinforced hammer unit? Its damage is just not good. Especially, I mean, just look at this chart. It's red all across the board. It's the worst at everything. Even with anti-infantry, it's still the worst. It is just not good damage output. The strike first utility is cool, but the problem is that once you have a reinforced unit of this, you're usually not charging something else at the same time, right? Or at least you'd be charging something like another cavalry unit, in which case, why wouldn't you just use more of that better cavalry unit, right? Like, javelins don't have this problem where they need to, they kind of work against themselves. The more javelins you bring, the better they get in terms of combat activations, because all their damage is front-loaded out of the combat phase. Stormstrike Paladors just get worse the more you bring. So they need to be significantly cheaper. We'll see even when we look at the efficiency, they are just not good per point. 210 is far too high for this unit.
Do you think that... Okay, so here's my question regarding that. Like, I know we talk about points efficiency with Stormstrike Paladors, and there's no way they should be 210. Like, Dracothian Guard are leagues above them, even in damage and efficiency. I have a feeling they will, like, even though they deserve to be 190, like Tempestors are currently, they can't ever do that because of that health pool. Like, there is a place in Warhammer where lots of meat on 3-up saves becomes really annoying to fight, not because it's good, but because nothing can really kill it fast enough. And it is a cavalry unit, which is why I'm like almost hesitant to think Games Workshop will consider this to be 190, which in my opinion is what it belongs at. Like for what you're getting in terms of damage, because it means for 380 points you'll be able to slam 30 wounds on a 3-up save.
Yeah, I agree that could definitely be a problem, but we're currently putting out 30 health on a 3-up save for 360 points with our infantry. And the infantry is going to do a lot more damage than this, so these guys are basically like a fast Redeemer unit. That's really what Stormstrike Paladors are. They're not comparable to a cavalry unit. It's like bringing mounted Liberators without crit
It's like the Chariot last edition. It's like the Stormstrike Chariot, how we were playing that last edition. Yeah. I get it.
There is a dangerous point where they become a spammable unit. I think that point would be about 160, 170. I think they can sit at the 190 threshold and be okay. I'm glad you picked up on the Stormdroid Guard, because this is something I argue with people all the time. I always say Stormdroid Guard are fantastic damage, and immediately people will come back and say, well, not for their point cost. And it's like, no, that's not what I said. I just said they are fantastic damage, and across the board they are. When you count the shooting, the charge mortal wounds from their rampage, their combat attacks, they have the best power through here because they're able to power through against almost everything, unlike a lot of these other cavalry, which will get stuck fighting other cavalry. Stormdroid Guard are a phenomenal unit. They do a tremendous amount of damage. Then they also have more health. They're also flying. They're one of the faster cavalry, right? They're not as slow as the Dracots. They have a lot going for them. They're a fantastic unit all around.
I think the only way you justify Stormdroid Guard is if your main battle plan has to change. You cannot play the tactical like this reacting calculated game. You have to have a plan to like basically kneecap your opponent.
Yeah, I think you're trying to table people when you bring Stormdrakes.
Yeah, because especially on the 6 objective maps, like it's gonna be very, very hard for you to get ahead on points unless you've completely just slain everything your opponent can throw at you.
For sure. That's definitely a problem with them. They are fast and extremely mobile, right? With their rampage, they can do some surprising movement in all phases of the game, which is really cool. Extra movement outside of the movement and charge phases is always very cool. So they're still good. We did give them A tier in the Battletome review for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Dracots are also efficient damage dealers, and I think they need to be efficient damage dealers in order to be useful. If they weren't doing efficient damage, well, they're slower than the other cavalry, only 10 inches. They can't shoot in combat like some of the other cavalry can. They need all-out attack in all the phases, unlike Stormdroid Guard, which already hit on 2s and shooting. They are the lowest health, the lowest model count, lowest control. They have so many downsides. If they weren't the most efficient damage output, they just wouldn't have a niche at all. So it's good to see that they are reasonably efficient. assuming you can meet their conditions, right? The Desolator block there is assuming you're fighting a unit with 10 or more models, that's hard to do. On a cavalry unit, that can be really tough to do. You're not always fighting what you want to be fighting. You need to be fighting everything with a cavalry unit. You need to charge a Gargant one game, and then you need to be able to charge a line of hex wraiths the next game. And sometimes you'll go a whole GT without ever getting them into combat with a 10 plus model unit. And even when you do get them into that scenario, I mean, fulminators just do more damage. All fulminators have to do is charge, and charge anything, any kind of unit, any size, any cavalry or infantry or monster, anything. And fulminators will do more damage. That's a much easier condition to meet, a lot more universal as well. So
another thing about Desolators is, in addition to that restriction you mentioned, is because of their that hamstring, that 10 plus model restriction existing, it hamstrings their shooting ability. Because let's say you encounter 10 hex raids. Well, congratulations, you're getting your bonus. Do you do the Drakon Breath on them?
Yeah.
You will be cutting out your bonus in the combat phase if you're getting ready to charge, and you are hamstringing yourself. And that's kind of why Desolators sort of suffer compared to the rest of the Dracothian Guard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's happened to me way too many times. Less of a problem with something like Decimators, which we'll talk about later, but Desolators in particular have that problem because they shoot, and they want to shoot. If you're not shooting with them, you shouldn't be bringing them, The last unit we haven't really talked about, there's two more I want to mention here. First up are Tempestors, while we're on the topic of Dracoths. They're just low impact. Across the board, they are doing worse damage than every other kind of Dracoth. They're doing comparable damage to Javelins, less in most cases. There's no justification for using them unless they're significantly cheaper than the other units. And I don't know if their current point values are at that.
Might be a scenario again, like a repeat of their edition, where they're just not good at release, but then probably a year or two from now, they might drop down all the way to so low that you're like, oh, I could run 4 of these now if I wanted to.
Yeah, that's their best cope in this whole edition, is they get cheap. And I think
they really are the Annihilators shields of last edition.
There is a point value where they will be good, and I think I know what it'll be. Before we talk about points, though, Dracolines. I've been hot on Dracolines this whole edition so far. They're a fantastic unit, and they are a fantastic unit despite doing less damage than Tempestors, which we're talking about how bad of a unit that is. Dracolines, however, don't have to shoot. They do their full damage whether they charged or not. They have all this defensive utility. So despite having low damage, Dracolines are still an excellent unit. So these numbers are they don't tell the full picture.
I think they're the only one from all these units. Almost all these units need to charge to do something. Dracolines, I believe, are the only true brawler cavalry we have, other than maybe Stormdrake Guard, in my opinion.
Yeah, and what I love about Dracolines is that they're able to redeploy onto enemy objectives that they don't control and gain strike first. And it's like, oh no, I want you to charge me because I'm going to do my full damage every time. It's fantastic. It's such a cool concept for a Stormcast unit.
Yeah, and that actually compensates pretty well for that low damage, because if opponents are coming into you when you have strike first, they are not fighting at full efficiency either, and that is extremely beneficial to you.
Let's talk about efficiency. So you can see Dracoths are far and away the most efficient, which is good. They would be unplayably bad if they weren't the most efficient cavalry, because the other cavalry would just be better because they have more health and more speed and everything. Dracolines are not efficient. Stormstrike Paladors are just not efficient, and it's so sad because they don't do good damage and they're not efficient. So what's their purpose? Stormdrake Guard efficiency drops off a cliff, so even though they are super high impact per point, they don't look great. But there's more to the game than just points, right? You have to balance impact of units and the efficiency of your list as well. Javelins are performing very well right now, and at 220 points, you can see that they're doing reasonably good damage for a unit that has, the most speed, the highest model count, the highest health, well, the second highest health, let's say. But for all the advantages that Vanguard Paladors have, they're not that far behind our other units in terms of damage output. They're about only 15% less efficient than concussors, and people are not using concussors. So damage is important, but it's not the only factor. Looking at a scenario with buffed up damage, Stormdrake Guard doing almost 30 damage to a 3+ save, that is tasty. That is just, I love it. if you can find a way to shut off commands, you can kill a unit of 6 Vanguard with the Knight Draconis and 4 Stormtrade Guard with 1 activation on average. That is just awesome. Love to see that.
I'd settle for deleting 5. Like, I wouldn't be sad if you deleted 5 out of the 6, let's be honest.
In terms of raw damage output, Fulminators also keeping up with Stormdrake, so Fulminators are a great unit. I think people are down on them because their health and everything is lower, but their damage is still just so good, and they're so much easier to use than infantry. Being a 10-inch move unit like that, they're still just really, really good. Desolators are misleading because it's hard to manufacture that scenario there. And the rest of our cavalry, you can see, it's what you expect. Vanguard Paladors are doing less damage. They're less efficient, but they're not so much worse that they're not usable. They're doing very well despite not being the highest damage output. Interestingly, in a buffed up scenario, Stormstrike Paladors start to look less bad. They're not good. They're still like best case scenario. They're better than Evocators in terms of damage, but that's still not very good. They do scale well with buffs, but there's not enough buffs in order to make them worthwhile at their current point cost. So what can we conclude from all this? Obviously, other factors have to be considered. It's not just going to be about damage. We need to talk about the speed. We need to talk about health, control, mobility, which hero buffs you're bringing, other factors like disabling commands on concussors. We didn't even mention how useful that can be. They can be a useful thing charging on their own, or enemies can charge into you. You can pop Quicksilver Draft, deny them from using all-out defense, and then everything you're doing is on 2s and 2s, and you're just smacking them strike first. That's a really cool combo. Definitely need to point out that Stormstrike Paladors are just bad. Their unique utility just doesn't offset their damage output. It's really poor. Their point cost is very high. Stormdrake Guard are really, really powerful, but very inefficient. You need some others. The rest of your list has to be very efficient in order to make up for it. You can't be running, a bunch of support heroes and Stormdrake Guard. That list just won't go anywhere. Concussors are not the best damage output, even in terms of the Dracoths, they're not the best, but they have really good synergy with the Quicksilver Draft to get that strike first combo. Tempestors could be playable. I think the right point value for them is 170, because you can see down in my suggested unit costs, they look very, very good at 170, and they kind of create this interesting point value around 320 to 360. Stormcast don't have a lot of melee units in that slot. And we've got things like Retributors and Evocators that are just hard to use, right? They're very specific units. I think if Tempestors were at that point value, it'd be a lot more interesting. It becomes like a discount hammer option. If you wanted to run, let's say, instead of putting all these points in expensive hammer units like Evocators or Stormdrakes, you could run literally almost 2 units of Tempestors rather than running 1 unit of Stormdrakes. Vanguard Paladors are obviously just too good, right? Their damage is good enough that all their other advantages, everything combined, makes them too powerful of a unit. I don't think they're like grossly overpowered, right? I think they don't need a plus 50 point nerf. I think a 20, 30 point nerf is enough for Javelins, and probably like a 10 point nerf for Paladors with axes. And I also want to mention Evocators and Draculines, I think, are a great unit. But one of the problems I have with them is that everything that supports them is just way too expensive, right? You can increase their damage output if you bring an Arcanum on Draculine, and you can return more models with the Arcanum on Griffcharger. But these heroes are, over 200 points each. It's almost another unit of Evocators. It's really, they're such cool combos, but you have to bring these like trash heroes, wizards with just 1 cast and +0 to cast. It's just not good for their current cost. So there's some point changes I'd like to see for Cavalry. Concussors, all the Dracoths go down by 10, basically. I think that would be warranted just to really create a bigger difference in their health pool so that you don't feel silly when you bring more Dracoths. Tempestors go down to 20 instead of 10. I think Javelins need to go up 20, and Axes need to go up 10. Do you guys think that's enough, or should it go even further?
I mean, I think it comes down to whether they increase points on Krondys or not, Krondys and Karazai. Because if they do that, like if Krondys goes up by 10, Karazai goes up by 10, then 20 on Javelins is fine. I think realistically what's more likely to happen is they just bump points on everything. +10 long strikes, +10 Krondys, +20 Vanguard Paladors with Javelins. Like I think this is what they're going to do. But, this doesn't show what they're going to do to Krondys and Long Strikes alongside it.
Yeah, I think it also depends on externally what else gets nerfed or buffed, because I know Cavalry is a problem in this game. So if everything else is going up and we're going up, we're relatively kind of at the same place.
Maybe it's more like it's just that all these cavalry armies that are at the top will just get replaced by like the other whatever is like waiting in the mid tables efficiency wise to come up. So I mean we'll still might be fine because you have other options, like we can build a lot of lists, but yeah, realistically I expect them to do what they did to that Bellacore list, which is for Krondys lists to go up by like 50 or 60 points, which means they have to drop a cav unit or something, which lots of people can deal with one Vanguard Palador and one Long Strikes. Not many can deal with two of each.
I will say I will take a point nerf over a Vanguard Wing nerf.
What would they even nerf with Vanguard Wing? You mean the Vanguard Chamber ability?
Yeah, the Vanguard Chamber ability, like make it once per turn.
Oh, they might do that, yeah. They might actually. I don't know. I think that'll just stop the Vanguard spam. It'll just mean you take Vanguard still, but you can only use it with one unit, so you take maybe 1 or 2 Vanguard units in your army, which is what I've been doing anyway.
Stormcast has such a deep bench that minor changes to unit efficiency can really swing things. So, for example, if Long Strikes went up 10 points per squad, all of a sudden Bow Judicators are just so much better, you basically wouldn't see Long Strikes anymore. It's a really delicate balance. Obviously, some units are falling out of that balance and they should be corrected. All the changes I'm suggesting here are just for internal reasons. I think there's definitely reasons to nerf Vanguard Paladors for external balance reasons, like army win rates should be considered. But just in terms of internal balance, I think these are the changes that could be made. All right, we're going to be moving on to talking about our Redeemer type units and then also our Elite Infantry. Before that, I want to preface it with this table, which I call Blessmaxxing. Bless is a very interesting buff. It can really only go on infantry units. Giving +1 attack really allows these units to pump out more damage. Without +1 attack, our infantry kind of does about the same as our cavalry, maybe even less in some cases. And it's really these kinds of bonuses that make infantry more appealing as damage dealers. They certainly need to have something because they are slow by design, right? Infantry is always generally slower than cavalry units. It's interesting to see that some units get a huge bonus out of Bless or Gardas effect, or both, right? If you're really crazy, you could run both of these. Liberators and Vindictors get a huge relative increase, but it really doesn't push them to anything significant. Vanquishers get a huge increase on top of a really respectable base of 42, increasing by 20, goes up to a new max of 62 max damage, which could be with Ren 2 against infantry. So Vanquishers have the potential to do a lot of damage if you give them Bless. Sequitors also, surprisingly, scale very well. Their max damage goes up very comparably to what Vanquishers do. Then you've got, Questers, Annihilators, Prosecutors, Praetors, all these units that are, max 38. They all get +12 from Bless and things like that, which is cool. Grandhammer Annihilators get a beefy +18. Their damage is already great, and getting a huge amount on top of that. The big winner with Bless, I would say, is definitely Prosecutors. Even though it doesn't feel like they get the most benefit from it, right? They only get 32% like a lot of other units. Prosecutors are just so easy to use. Like, after you bless them, they will charge their target, which isn't something you can say for any other unit on this list, especially if you're blessing, that means you're on the table, right? That means you are trying to walk and then charge into combat, or you're teleporting and then hoping for a 9. You're not doing any kind of fancy reserve plays. So it's all telegraphed. The only exception is Prosecutors. When you bless Prosecutors and you teleport them with the portal or with translocation, they can do a lot of damage very reliably. Right, so let's start with the basic melee units. We call these guys the Redeemer type units. They're usually Redeemer Conclave, except for the Vanguard Hunters, which are Angelos. These are typically used as screens, and I think this analysis will prove why we usually use them as screens and why we're not using them as reinforced units. We're going to compare them reinforced to Quester Soulsworn, since they come out as a similar press point, around 200 to 240 points, somewhere in that range. Again, like the Cavalry, we're going to look at conditional bonuses. We're going to assume those are activated. We're not going to look at anti-X. We will talk about it, but it's not going to be a separate case. Vanquishers fighting with less than 5 models it's the same profile as Vindictors, so it's not worth having a separate case for that. We're also not going to have buffs to attack, hit, or wound, because there are very serious opportunity costs associated with these. All-out attack, finest hour, generally better used on harder hitting melee units like our paladin type units or our cavalry. And it can be hard for these guys to connect with targets of Vigilors, unlike with shooting and cavalry that have better threat ranges. Now, all of these units do have very similar scaling with +1 hit and +1 wound. There's not a significant difference, for example, between Vanquishers as a percentage, how much they gain from +1 hit versus Vindictors. So it's all kind of a wash. Now, I did say these guys are all pretty similarly costed. Sequitors are way too much. And you'll see that when we get to the efficiency. So let's look at just their damage output. Some interesting stuff on this table is Liberators are actually doing well into 2+ saves. Relative to these other units, Liberators actually have a niche, which is interesting. I didn't expect that. I figured they would just be behind Vanquishers in all counts, but it turns out that Crit Mortals are really good into Kraken armor. Vindictors are just bad across the board. There's no justification to use Vindictors for damage output at all. Even with the anti-charge active to give them an extra rend, they're going to do the worst damage out of all these units. Vanguard Hunters, if they shoot and fight, will do more damage than Vindictors striking first with anti-charge active. They're just not good. Not a good unit. Sequitors really surprised me. I knew Vanquishers would be doing good damage. I didn't expect Sequitors with a 5-up crit buff to get this high. That's almost like good damage output, you know? It's not good, but it's almost there.
It's almost there, but also you need to consider, like, I think the reason they're pointed so high is like it's like almost like a fear of what might happen if they didn't, because I've tried them and they're not good. Like, don't get me wrong, they're bad, but that ability where they channel their power into their shields and they negate all the special weapon rules, that can come in really handy in like a cavalry meta where everyone's like, you know, minus infantry, -2, auto crit, auto wound, whatever else they have. It just negates all their like special weapon rules.
Yeah, the problem is that they're going to get hit by something that still kills them anyway, because they're only 20 health on a 3-up save, and then there's so much of your list at 340 points. It's like, I don't know if I can justify that.
Yeah, if you don't have a Toleron behind them, they're not good.
Vanquishers obviously are the standout. Everybody's seen it firsthand. When they get buffed up, they can deal some pretty significant damage, even compared to Questers, which I think Questers are a fair unit to compare other units to, because Questers feel so fair. They're useful. They're efficient. So comparing them to Questers is fine. And they're going to push past Questers once you give them +1 damage and you give them anti-infantry. But then they have this other scenario where they're doing worse than Vindictor damage, because Vindictors can at least get anti-charge. Vanquishers can be they can be okay, or they can be complete trash, which is cool. I think that's a cool design, especially at that price point. Looking at it per point, again, Vindictors just the worst across the board. Liberators are surprisingly good into 2-ups, Vanquishers into everything else. Questers, you can see, are just an efficient choice. Sequitors had some good damage, but per point at 340, no way. There's no argument for it. This is, again, best case scenario. They're contesting an objective. They get the 5-up crits, which means they don't want the defensive bonus. Hunters are not good at 120 points. Even if they shoot and they fight, they're doing worse than Liberators who are just fighting, which means if Hunters are ever fighting off your turn, they're doing even less than that. They're just not good. But notice how all of these values are just so much worse than the cavalry. Like, the raw damage values are so low, but the efficiency is actually not that far off. It's not good, but it's not like cavalry are twice as efficient at dealing damage. The problem is that if you can bring 400 points of damage of cavalry, you're going to do more than you would bring of 200 points of this unit, right? It's about condensing your power into a single unit so that you can deal significant damage to your opponent.
Also the speed. Like,
well, yeah.
You're not calling up the board, and you have actual delivery systems. Vanguard Hunters are very interesting. I feel like that's one of the units they could actually drop to 110 or 100, or even 100, and it won't be a problem, because you can't take them because of the regiment restriction. Like, I have to take a Lord Aquilor or a War Master to be able to bring them.
Yep. And
So,
even if you bring
yeah.
multiple units, you can only ever hunt one unit. Only one unit gets hunted keyword. So if you want to keep the +2 movement buff on them, you don't kill the hunted target. But if you want to benefit from hunting to get +1 hit, you have to kill the target and then you lose your movement. Like it's just the design is at odds with itself. So what can we draw from conclusions? Well, none of these units deal enough damage to be considered a hammer unit. Even Vanquishers in the best case scenario are, let's say, comparable to Questers. Obviously, they're a little bit better. The stars need to align to hit a 5+ model unit with infantry keyword. Then Vanquishers are fine. But in every other scenario, you just brought bad Vindictors, so they're just not good. Vindictors are such a poor unit in terms of damage that they kind of act as a floor for Stormcast points. Everything has to be compared to them. Their only real value in terms of point cost is going to end up being their health. And although I am proposing that they go down 10 points here, the only reason I'm doing that is because I think other units can go down to 100 points. So, for example, Liberators, Vanguard Hunters, those units feel like they should be 100 points given what we've seen on these charts. But if they're 100 points, Vindictors have no role whatsoever. So I think Vindictors need to go down to 90. Now, that does create a problem, and that you've now created a 180 point, 20 health unit on a 3-up save, and that can create some really, really bad gameplay. So maybe the solution is that Vindictors need to increase their unit size. Right? Maybe they need to be a 10 model unit that can't be reinforced for something like 180 points. I don't know. I'm not sure what the solution is. I just know Vindictors have a very bad war scroll, and they're kind of holding back the rest of the book from getting to where it needs to be.
I still wish all our Redeemers just had one more attack on their profiles. I think it would just help a lot.
A situational bonus is cool. Like, Vanquishers feel great. They have a high strength, a high cap, but then they're also, potentially really, really bad. And if you put them in the right scenario, they feel great. And if they're not in the right scenario, well, they're a cheap screen. What did you expect, Like, I think that's a fine design for these Redeemer type units. If Liberators, for example, could get +1 attack while they're contesting an objective, if Vindictors could get +1 attack when an enemy charge them, like, if there's a situational way to increase their damage, then I think that would be really cool.
I think it's damage. Yeah, you nailed it. It's like Liberators should be, if the role for Liberators this edition was to control home objectives, they should be +1 damage. Same for Vindictor, or +1 attack, like something that ups their damage. That ups their max damage. I should be more specific, because Vindictors technically are doing more damage with -2 rend if they get charged, but they needed like +1 attack in addition to that.
Yeah, max 11 damage is not going to do much, even if you strike first, even if you have rend 2. On 3s, it's just not that good.
Yeah, you'll be lucky if you kill one cavalry model.
And then let's look at our elite melee units. So these are the paladin type units. Now, I've brought prosecutors in here, even though they are kind of more like a redeemer type unit because they're only 2 health. I think their function is to serve as a hammer unit, so I'm going to group them in here. We're going to, again, put them reinforced. We're going to see their max damage output. Units that shoot and fight like prosecutors are going to have both. Conditional bonuses like charge +1. All these things will be considered. Hit and wound will be considered as well, because these guys are a primary hammer unit like cavalry. They're not like Redeemers where there's better units to use your buffs on. These are the units you buff, right? We will not be considering +1 attack. You can just go back to the Blessmaxxing chart to reference what kind of scaling effect that's going to have, because you just multiply it by that amount, because all of these units only have one weapon profile. It's very easy. You take the average damage, you multiply it by that factor, and that's the new average damage. Now, Praetors, Annihilators, and Questers all have the same profile. Since Praetors and Annihilators cost more than Questers, I'm not going to bother calculating things for those units. Just know that they're less efficient than Questers. Retributors and Decimators are assumed to use 0 Star Soul Maces, while Protectors are assumed to use 4 Star Soul Maces. Let's look at the chart. So we've got Questers at the top here. Their raw damage output is not good, but obviously that's to be expected when it's a non-reinforced unit without crit mortals, without any special stuff. They're just high max damage for a good point cost. Reclusians do pretty good into 2-up saves, but again, only 6 models, max 38. They're just Questers with crit mortals. That's all they are. Prosecutors, similar. They do get higher max damage output because they do have that shooting attack, which can surprise you, especially if you can pin something down so that they can't redeploy away, and you can just teleport prosecutors where they need to, and they can chuck, 7d3 worth of spears at something. It can add up. It's pretty good. And then we get to the big hitters. Annihilators with Grand Hammers are still just the kings of damage in terms of infantry. Crushing, 21 damage into a 3-up save. That's just tremendous. Not as good as Cavalry. A lot of our Cavalry units can do better. Fulminators and Storm Drakes are going to do more damage. Fulminators are at a similar price point, which makes you think, why am I taking all the risks with these infantry units if I could just use Cavalry? Why bother? Decimators are a very interesting one. They are without a doubt the highest damage output in the entire Stormcast army in the right scenario. Having crit hits and then getting +1 damage against any unit with 10 or more models. Decimators are just, they decimate. They're the highest damage output. No questions asked. Even when they're not hitting the right target, even if they're fighting something with 9 models or fewer, they're still doing good damage, right? Like, if prosecutors are good, decimators do the same damage as prosecutors would in a turn, even when they're not fighting the best target. So it's not like they're bad, they're just not optimal. Foot evocators are just bad, though, unfortunately. They're pretty similar to liberators. Foot evocators are only 31 max with crit mortals, while liberators are 25 max with crit mortals. And as we see in the efficiency afterwards, they're just way less efficient. Retributors are kind of like Reclusians, more health instead of access to a 5-up ward and the chamber ability. Yeah, they're kind of just pointless, right? I think I'd rather always use Reclusians. There's very little argument to use Retributors. And just for interest, I put the Protectors on there just to showcase just how bad their damage is. It's not good. A little bit better than Quester, but they don't have the teleport. So I think Questers are all around a better unit. In terms of efficiency, what you would expect, the highest damage guys, it turns out they're the most efficient. Decimators and Grand Hammers are the most efficient. But I think what's really interesting on this chart is prosecutors are a reasonably efficient unit when you factor in their shooting and their fighting, especially against lower safe targets, against 4s, 5s, 6s. They start to get really good, like comparable to the cavalry units. And with that 3d6 charge and the 12-inch flying move, they're easy to deliver. So if we can manage to put together some armor shredding stuff, with Krondus or Purple Sun, all these effects that reduce enemy save rolls, prosecutors all of a sudden become very good damage output. Probably to the point where I would consider running 2 units of 6 alongside Krondus. And hey, didn't that list just do really well recently?
I do think our prosecutors are probably our best elite unit. Just in ease of use, I feel like. And they, like you said, they scale really, really well. And I think they scale so well, and they're pretty good at what they need to do in this GHB, that 2x6 is actually a valid choice when you run them. And they're not exactly hard to slot in either. Like, a lot of the heroes we're using could take Ruination stuff too, so they're not super hard to slot in.
I'd say Ruination is the second easiest to bring after Warrior Chamber, obviously. Warrior is very easy to bring in every list. Every list will very easily bring that. One of my problems with the 2x6 Prosecutor is that you still want to bring shooting, and you still want to bring some amount of support and screens and all that. So you end up cutting the cavalry. And I find that to be a weird place, because then you don't have any kind of brawler type unit. And then the prosecutors, you send them out, they die. You send them out, they die. And then all you have left is screens and shooting. And you're not really going to contest objectives that well with that. So if your prosecutors don't do really, really important damage and they die, then you're just left with nothing. So I'm trying to find a list that can balance that out. I really like prosecutors with Dracolines so far. I think that's been a really good combo, because Dracolines have that staying power, they have that brawling power, and then prosecutors come in as like a scalpel unit. They just take out an important piece in the enemy army.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has to be kind of like that Worlds list where it's like you also had Krondy. I think he had like a unit of Cav too as well, like just something thick, like just thicker to take a blunt blow, because the prosecutors can't do that because it's 12 wounds at the end of the day.
Let's take a look at the buffed up scenarios. Decimator scaling is crazy. They just go so nuts. When you see that you can do 46 damage to a 4-up save, yeah, that's really good. It has to be a 10 model unit, but those do exist. It's not like there aren't any of those, right? We've got Nighthaunt, we've got Lumineth, we've got Skaven. There's lots of armies that like to bring units that are 10 plus models, and Decimators are just doing really, really well to them. Unfortunately, when they're so expensive, when they're not fighting the right target, it ends up making them a liability. And given that infantry is just a liability in general, it's hard to get to the right target at the right time, even if it's in your opponent's list, right? Infantry has trouble being delivered right now. All the options for delivering our infantry units are very expensive and less reliable than they've ever been, I think, right? We used to have reasonably good delivery with the Lord Imperatant. We just don't have the same thing anymore. So what conclusions can we draw about our Paladin type units? Well, of course, like the other units, we have to consider their health, their movement, what regiments they go into, how much their supporting heroes cost, all of these things. I think Questers feel fair at 230 points. They can be used as a baseline. We can say, well, compared to Questers, this unit does X. And since Questers are a fair unit, well, that gives us a good measuring stick. I think Reclusians and Prosecutors are well designed. They have divine strength and divine weaknesses. You know, Reclusians are slow, but they get that really good combo with Quicksilver Draft, and they're relatively durable at 18 health. They can get a 5-up ward, they can get Shock and Awe, they can get Quicksilver Draft as a defensive tool. The only thing I would say needs to change with the Ruination Chamber units on this list is that the Lord Vigilant on Griftstalker is just way too expensive. Fighting twice is really, really powerful, but when it's tied to a 180 point hero that does like literally nothing else, there's nothing else on his war scroll, that feels really bad. So I think if he goes down another 20 points, maybe even 30 points, then that's it. No more changes are needed for the Ruination Chamber. It is just perfect. You can just slap a lid on it.
Yeah, I would say with the Ruination Chamber, I like how we haven't even considered all the F tier units in our battle tome. But I think with those going down further, I think it unlocks a lot of the other more elite units too, because like the Knight Azeros or Tornus going down would actually be pretty good for some of our elite melee infantry units.
I dream of a world I could play an Azeros competitively.
I know. 150 point Azeros, I think it would do it. You have to point the Azeros, and Tornus is around the same as a Lord Terminus, I think would do it.
Looking at the Warrior Chamber units, Grand Hammers have tremendous damage. They're reasonably efficient damage as well, but they have so many drawbacks, right? Their health is low, same health as something like Questers, but they cost a lot more than Questers. They don't have that kind of protection that the Ruination Chamber units get with the Ruination Chamber ability and the 5-up ward. They are just, point, click, delete, and then die. And they need to be reasonably efficient and in order to trade well for that. If you send a 400-point unit to kill a 400-point unit, you're losing. You're behind, right? Because you've spent other abilities and stuff in order to deal that damage. In order to get Grand Hammers reliably into combat, you have to bring something like a Lord Imperatant, which is, I think, 150 points right now. You have to bring Gardas, who's currently 170 points right now. You have to bring Gavriel, who's 140 points right now. All of these costs have to be baked into the Grand Hammers, and in order to offset that cost, you need to start bringing more and more infantry. So you're like doubling down on bad units. You could just bring cavalry instead, right? So in order for Grand Hammers to be more viable, I think this is true of all the infantry here, but Grand Hammers seem to have this problem the worst because they're just so much more fragile than everything else here. It's weird. Grand Hammers feel more fragile than Prosecutors. Even though they have more health, they feel like they just die faster. But I think Grand Hammers need to go down probably about 20 points, and then all the heroes that support them need to go down as well. Either that, or we have a significant redesign for the Lord Imperatant. I think that would probably go a long way, but the way things stand now with no rule changes, I think Grand Hammers are just not efficient enough to see play.
Yeah, I've tried making Grand Hammer lists, and it's like there's two versions, and both of them involve over-investing in units that are adjacent to Grand Hammers to actually make them work, so which actually brings down their point efficiency, because you're spending more points just so you can make that 210-point unit work. in my first list, it's like the Lord Imperator and Gardas, or Gabriel, but I'm trying to move away from Legends units, so Gabriel would be better for now, but Gardas would be the replacement once that goes away. And the other list is Gardas and a Lord Celestant. And I'm basically trying a Quicksilver Draught combo with the Grand Hammers, or just charging with as many charge bonuses and moving bonuses I can get out of Deep Strike. It's not good. Yeah, I think all these like combat heroes and like that entire package basically needs to get cheaper one way or another.
Yeah, it's got to drop by like a lot, by like 100 points.
Yeah, because cavalry is just easier to use right now.
Yeah. Infantry could scale higher. We've got things like Gardas pushing Grand Hammers even further beyond what you're seeing here. But none of that really matters when Gardas is 170 points. If you're spending 410 plus 170, you can almost bring Storm Drakes for that cost. And they're going to be way more reliable, way easier to use, way more durable, take buffs really well. There's almost no downside to using cavalry, and there's only downside to using infantry. And we haven't even mentioned just how much anti-infantry there is in the game. There's almost no anti-cavalry. There's less anti-monster. Almost everything in the game is anti-infantry. It's so ubiquitous in 4th edition that all of this stuff just dies so quickly.
Yeah, it is weird. Yeah, I mean, we're in the same position as last time, right? When we said, why wouldn't I just take Stormdrake Guard for the cost of the Imperator and the double Grand Hammer package?
Yeah.
But yeah, I believe they'll get cheaper. You don't really see a lot of this scene play. I don't believe the Bastion AOR, although fun, is any good. So
yeah, hopefully that doesn't hold back the cost of Grand Hammers from dropping down, because I do think they need to go down probably about 20 points.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of our infantry.
I mean, they were 200 last edition, where they were considerably better, way better than what they are now. And I don't see why they couldn't at least be 200. I would say lower, yeah. I would say 190 is probably the right cost for that many wounds that you're getting. Yeah.
I'd like to see our heroes in general go down about 25%. I think that helps out a lot of our units that we talked about. If our heroes in general just go cheaper, especially if they're not like a wizard or priest, like you're literally just taking it for a very specific reason. Like, I understand wizards and priests have to be a little higher and have attacks because they bring stuff to your army, but like if you're taking like a Parenton or Gardas, like it's a very specific reason you are, and it's just tax for whatever else you're bringing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, David. I don't know why all the non-wizard priest heroes are costed so high, but I'd like to see at least a 20-point decrease on pretty much all of them. The non-wizard priests, 20 to 30.
If you compare, say, 6 Reclusians and a Terminos, right? Terminos is 150. I think he's overcosted, but he goes with a unit that is fairly costed, which is Reclusian, so you don't feel so bad about it. Then you look at a combo like Grand Hammers and Lord Celestant. It's the same combo. You're trying to get people to charge you. You pop the Quicksilver Draft, then you fight first. The Grand Hammers do a lot more damage, but that whole combo costs way more points. Instead of 430, you're over 500. So if these two combos are comparable in cost, well, then it comes down to preference and regiments and things like that. I still think even if they cost the same, these two combos, Reclusian combo would still probably be better, just because of Ruination Chamber and access to the 5-up ward. Which is crazy to think that Grand Hammers have to get so cheap that they're when they combo with Lord Celestant, they end up being cheaper than the Reclusians. But that's almost the point you have to get at, It's tough. There's other changes they could do. I think a huge cut to Gardas, like if he was 120, like I've suggested here 140, but let's say Gardas was 120. Well, that really kicks open the door for a lot of infantry-based stuff. If Blessed Weapons chanted on a 4 instead of a 6, which is just silly that it chants on a 6, given that only infantry can use it, and it just makes cavalry look better and better, to have Blessed Weapons to be so hard to chant. If it was a 4, okay, well, yeah, a lot of this stuff looks a lot easier to pull off, more reliable. I think really, though, the biggest change that we would see that would have the biggest impact is to redesign the Lord Imperator. His ability does not account for how 4th edition plays. It doesn't account for redeploy being used after deep strikes, or if it does, then the ability is far too weak. Moving a unit D3 once per game for 150 points, yeah, it's 3 units, but you're not realistically charging 3 units like that with Stormcast. We're not going to charge 3x3 Grand Hammers. That's not a thing we're going to do. We're going to charge.
But even then, he's not a Grand Hammer vehicle, right? Because you could move any units. So
Yeah.
I don't know why he's been designed this way. I would rather him just be able to deliver only Stormcast infantry, but have them move like guaranteed 3 inches or something.
Yeah.
Like you can just move 3.
Yeah, if it was like here's an idea I pitched earlier on the Discord server. If he could only use his ability on the units in his regiment was restricted to warrior chamber infantry, but it moved the units 3 inches.
Yeah,
I think that
like
would be
last
just fine.
edition, he was like basically just a vehicle for Thunderstrike infantry, which meant Annihilators most of the time and sometimes Vanquishers, and he was fine. They changed the ability to affect every Stormcast Eternal unit, but then made it a lot worse with redeploy, which really just ends up nerfing Grand Hammers. I don't know, I don't know what was going on over there.
I don't really see the Lord Imperator from a narrative perspective. I don't see him like leading Storm Drakes into battle, right? Like he's always kind of been tied to these Thunderstrike units.
Yeah,
infantry.
That's what he drops down with. Drops down with Praetors and Annihilators next to him.
Yeah. So it's weird that he can tell Vanguard units to move forward. It's weird he can tell Storm Drakes to move forward. It's just a strange decision. Regardless, I think the infantry in the Stormcast book is in a much worse state than the cavalry. Our cavalry is really well designed. Our shooting is pretty close to being well designed. I'd say just some point cuts, and we're on a good spot right there. But infantry definitely needs some work. Any last thoughts before we close it out, guys?
Don't be afraid to experiment. Yeah, we have a lot of good tricks, so just see what works for you.
Yeah, looks good, guys. Just have fun with it. Like, regardless of where they nerf us, we'll always find a way to bounce back. And if past experience is anything to go by, our book only gets better in points-wise as time goes on, eventually.
Every time they nerf us, we find another way. There's always another way.
I am a little salty about Holy Commands, though. Like, that was our one sort of unique enhancement, and, like, looking at the Slaves of Darkness tome where they have unique enhancements, like, I'm like, come on. Could have given us something there.
And that'll do it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Thanks, especially if you found this useful or interesting. Please leave a like and subscribe and all that stuff that people always tell you to do on YouTube videos. If you think we missed anything or our analysis is lacking, please leave a comment. We want to talk to you about what we got wrong. Are we missing something really important about one of these units? If you want to talk about Age of Sigmar, come join the Stormkeep Discord server. We talk there all day, every day. And consider supporting this podcast by becoming a member on YouTube or joining us on patreon.com/thestormkeep. Members will get access to videos early. They'll also get access to all the slides that we put forward to all these videos. Okay, well, that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And from everybody at the Stormkeep, we'll see you in the next one.
See you guys.
See you guys.